very much for joining our technical webinar session, wherein we provide knowledge dissemination session to our esteemed customers, partners, and the stakeholders within the ecosystem. Today's topic is identified as best practices getting your ERP implemented right. A very, very vital key successful digital transformation is something we'll discuss today. Next slide, please. Just want to let you know that we will be recording today's webinar for future usage. Today's webinar will be presented to you by Sreekanth Ramakrishnan, who is our Chief Mentor and Operating Officer of RheinBrücke. Myself, Sreekanth Ramakrishnan, and I am heading the channel for RheinBrücke, and we are building up channel-based ecosystem within the Middle East countries. Next slide, please. Today's agenda is about a very brief explanation about our speaker and RheinBrücke at a glance. We would cover the whole thing in like 8 minutes time, followed by the actual content of the presentation, which is a project-based or outcome-based. That discussion will happen, followed by the methodologies in detail, deep dive in terms of the project management methodologies, followed by summary and questionnaire. So feel free to type your questions on the top left-hand corner wherein Q&A is displayed, and we would take as many questions as possible. For your convenience, you can also check the button here called Conserve Bandwidth. You might use this to optimize your bandwidth and enjoy a seamless presentation. Next slide, please. Sreekanth Ramakrishnan is our Chief Mentor and Operating Officer at RheinBrücke, having close to 2 decades of experience in consulting, operations, strategic management, and technology implementation business improvement domain. He has deep expertise in leading and strategizing professional services business with a key acumen into enterprise systems integration and enterprise strategic plan for IT landscape, including portfolio rationalization. He has proven track record of global experience across 20 countries. He specializes in organizational change management, business transformation, and providing cutting-edge technology consulting for enterprise programs and adapting organizational strategic directives to enabling technologies. Next slide, please. My name is also Sreekanth. I'm heading the channel for RheinBrücke, and we are building a channel ecosystem to provide better solutions and services to our esteemed customers in this region. RheinBrücke, next slide, please. RheinBrücke is a European company with a global mindset. We have a strong footprint in Europe, and we span across Middle East with a strong distribution network in this region. The core pillar of RheinBrücke is providing IT and ERP consulting services, and we are close to 250 associates who are certified across different technologies and project management, including ITIL-based certification to provide a seamless solution and support services to our esteemed customers. RheinBrücke designs and delivers solutions that enable the mid-market organizations, the mid-market enterprises in today's complex business environment. We help our clients achieve measurable business benefits by connecting business and technology with people to provide an optimal solution to the customers. We provide different varieties of solutions, on-premise, perpetual licenses. We provide cloud-based solutions. We provide integrated end-to-end enterprise solutions into the mid-market segment. We offer our solution into 4 pillars, namely the Epicor, on-premises, in the cloud. We do product development. We have our own IP on procurement, strategic procurement products. We have enterprise business solutions. We have business intelligence solutions and IoT and AI-based solutions for our esteemed customers. We also do a little bit of consulting and advisory work from the core consulting mechanism with industry experts on our team. Next slide, please. I would currently hand over the presentation to Sri. Over to you, Sri. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sri, and thank you all gentlemen, ladies, on this webinar. We thank you for your time and attention. And as the topic goes, the focus of this particular session is how do you get your investments on your ERP right? As the first stepping stone towards achieving digital transformation, and you do that starting with your ERP that goes electronic. So the concept that we want to be able to get across and educate and exchange with you is
fantastic, right? Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for your attendance on this session today. What I want to be able to run through today in this particular session is to be able to talk about what is it that we must do to be able to get our outcomes right in an ERP implementation. And why do we get it right is because when we make an investment into an ERP project, we're looking at benefits realization. Hence, and that is our first step towards digital transformation. So the session today, we will walk through in terms of the essential ingredients that we need in order to be able to achieve that success and to get it right. And the focus is to be able to shift, be able to realize those benefits from a typical project-based approach into an outcome-based approach. In the end, it is based on the thinking that why do we have to make an investment into your first step towards digitalization of your business to bring about an ERP into your business. Of course, it is a project. It must be handled as a project. But for us to be able to get those true benefits of that investment, we must be able to manage it towards the outcome that we are expecting and against which we are managing. You take a typical project and an initiative such as this, it has 6 key themes around which how you typically do your ERP initiative. One is have a focus. Next is look at the deliverables. Look at how we measure it. How do we quantify success? What are the processes? How do we go about doing this? How do you look at the initiative? Whom do we report to? Who's accountable for it? And finally, how we look at the time. All of this, when you look at it as a project, it is just the 101s of project management. However, the shift that is needed in order for you to be able to get it right, get the output correctly to how you have envisioned it at the start of an ERP implementation, is to be able to manage it towards an outcome. If you take the focus, you look at benefit optimization. What is the benefit that we are expecting an ERP system to bring to the business? And how do we manage it to be able to optimize such benefits? Number one, if you look at delivering of a project, as a project manager, or if somebody is managing a project for you, and if you're the project sponsor, it is around Gantt charts, schedules, work plans, estimations, project reports, progress reports, and so on. However, if you look at how do you want to manage the outcome, the perspective changes from such deliverables into looking at steps that will actually review. How do you look at your value that you're generating out of this project? Can we do something better while we are going through these execution of these deliverables so that we get better incremental value? How do we plot it? Do we create some S-curves? How do we manage this particular project in its life cycle? How do we typically measure it? A typical project approach is on time, on budget, delivery of system, risk management, and so on and so on. Of course, we must do all this. But the shift is, if you're able to turn how you measure success, is it delivering towards the promised results against which why we made this investment? How do we maximize the business value against this particular system? How do we convert this from a software implementation into a business initiative? So if you take that shift and take that into processes, you start to look at how you execute a project as a process differently. You take it from looking at an initiation, monitoring, and closeout. That is typically how you look at it as a project. The language shift is, what is the definition of the initiative? Why did we have this ERP as an initiative? What is the value it is expected to bring? Are we progressing against the value that we're expecting it to bring? And are we aligning the results against the value that we're expecting to bring at the beginning? So that is the shift towards outcome management. Typical, you're accountable as a project manager, you're accountable to your project sponsor, probably the person who signs the check, and also you're probably reporting to your boss, who's probably the program head. But if the moment you start to take outcome management as an approach, you're actually facilitating quantification of the value that you're creating and the stakeholders of such value. So you're taking a total business view rather than a project view. timeline as well. So you stop thinking from just planning to implementation. That's a typical project. But you start to plan from, yes, of course, implementation, but into results attainment against which why we started this initiative itself. So it is the same thing about how you manage a project, how you do this, but you have a different perspective and you manage against that different perspective. So what are the pillars to be able to obtain a successful outcome in an ERP project? Number one is you must have a methodology that's robust. That is the binding force around everything. Second, you should be able to manage the scope. Bring in best practices. You must be able to define the scope, define and control the scope as well as you go through the initiative. Third pillar, you should have effective means of organizational change management. There must be measures to be able to manage this change. Because as I said, the moment you start to take a shift towards benefit realization and value creation and so on, you're bringing in a business change, and having that necessary focus around change management in your organization is an essential ingredient. Last one is you must have those steps in place to be able to control your project as well as your value management. How much value are you adding back to the business? These are the 4 pillars that you must concentrate on while you're executing a project in order for you to have a successful outcome and just not having a project. So we will focus in this particular session today in terms of how we should go about doing this, the best practices around to be able to do so around these 4 pillars, and that's what we would have. I would like this to be far more engaging. So any questions that you have, please feel to start to write in. If we don't have the time to answer that today in this particular session, I will take time out to write to each of you personally and to be able to address those questions. So coming back to managing an outcome, the first pillar around that is the methodology. The methodology binds everything together. And the question is, what is the methodology and why do you need one, right? What is the necessity of one and what is it that a methodology should contain? Many of you are probably looking at an ERP implementation right now, or probably considering one now, going through an evaluation phase maybe. Some of you have probably finished an ERP implementation and probably reflecting upon your experience and maybe looking at the next one in your career. Some of you are probably midway through, and however, right? When I talk through these steps, you'll be able to reflect upon each of them as well. So what are the steps, things that are needed, essential components of a methodology? And the reason why methodology is also key is that when you look at project success rates and when you measure project success rates against how much value and benefit have they created against the initiative, you will notice that wherever there is a negative observation, most of the time it is probably around how the project has been managed rather than the software itself or rather than any other functional area or the complexity. If you're able to manage that to a better outcome, you would have that result. So that is what we will try to cover. So the components that are essential is number one is when you're starting off onto your project to be able to get it right, you must first have the appropriate methods to be able to transition from a buying psychology to an implementing psychology. When you buy the system, of course, you are looking at it as functionality. You want to get the best value for your money. You want it to bring in the functionality that you probably don't need today, but for tomorrow. You also want it to be technology proof, you want it to be future proof, and so on and so on. So once you start the project, the methodology must support a mechanism where you're able to let go of that thinking and incorporate a thinking of how to implement, which is how do you scope, how do you transition from that particular thought process and what is the shift, how do you manage that shift, which is right sizing the scope. There must be a method to be able to right size scope. That is number one. While you go through your methodology, if you're working with any of your implementation partners, if you're evaluating one, if you're in the middle of a project as well, right? Look at any steps that are in the methodology that are ambiguous. There must be a clarity in execution in terms of how the project gets executed, number one, especially around areas that are highest risk in an ERP project, around data. Are the tasks, as the project plan methodology, is it very clear on these elements, right? And any other associated risks. Third one, need for practicality. Many methodologies also try to advocate the concept of a do-it-yourself. That is, we will train the trainers, they will be able to implement it on their own. Yes, the philosophy is correct, it has long-term benefits, for a customer, and so on. However, please evaluate your methodology for the need for practicality. It is ideal, but sometimes might not be applicable in selected cases. So the guidance is that when you evaluate your methodology thoroughly, look for practicality. If it is inclining towards too much of a do-it-yourself kind of an approach, evaluate it, and then agree with your implementation partner for the right sizing of those tasks as well. Many of your partners, including us and several other companies over the years, have perfected the art of being able to deliver projects remotely. They probably are able to deliver projects through nearshore centers, offshore centers, on-site as well. This has gone even further because of the COVID-19 situation, where there's necessity to work remotely. So when you look at your methodology, also evaluate if it has those essential tools and processes in terms of how information, work packets are transferred between individuals sitting remotely, right? Between users who sit remotely and consultants who sit remotely. Evaluate the methodology for robustness in this particular site. Budget control, fiscal management, look for clear directives in your methodology. How well is it able to provide the direction in terms of how budgets will be controlled, how the project will be controlled from an earned value perspective? Does it provide you the visibility in terms of the incremental value that your project is generating towards the business? Does the methodology have an approach around? That is an area for you to evaluate. Data management, big risk. Ensure that the methodology has meticulous details around planning for data migration. Do not simplify data migration. It's one of the biggest risks in an ERP project. Finally, of course, when you're doing a project such as this, an ERP project is around change, around people. Hence, it must be able to support organizational change management. Typically, it doesn't. So these are the essential components that a methodology must have. So while you're going through your implementation phase, if you're evaluating your implementation and so on, please open up and look at these critical components that are needed. So that takes us to, what is it that you should look for? What you see on the screens is a typical 5-stage methodology. If you're using a different ERP, if you're looking at a different ERP other than Epicor, if you're talking to a different vendor, they might have a different methodology and so on. More or less, everything will fall under give and take these 5 steps. What we typically follow and preach is a typical 5-stage waterfall methodology. You start from preparing for the project, you go into planning for it, subsequently you design the system against the requirements, against the value that the customer is expecting. Then you allow for the customer to validate if the system is designed to deliver how it was, is it performing to deliver against how it was designed. Finally, you take it to the last end user or the consumer of the system and deploy it. That is a typical 5-phase project. So what should you look for in the context of these 4 pillars that we're looking for outcome management and benefit management? The first thing is our first pillar for risk that we must control, which is management of scope. And as I said in my prelude, the first risk that we should be able to address is how do you transition from a buying psychology to an implementing psychology? Scope management is key, and scope management not only means transitioning from that psychology, but to be able to inherit either ERP best practices of that particular ERP, Epicor in this case, right? Or the industry best practices, or a combination of both as normalized process maps. Take that as the input, perform a risk assessment in terms of the gaps that you look at for, and map each of those gaps against the outcome and the business benefit that you are trying to look for into the system. This is what the methodology should be able to support. Plus, it should be able to support how you will evolve that scope that is aligned to benefits throughout its life cycle. So you should be able to quantify that particular scope, evolve, and eventually you should be able to manage that particular outcome. So typically, as you see here, right, your scope is managed, you conceive the scope correctly during prepare, then you evolve it as you go through the design. End of that particular design phase, you validate it if it meets it correctly, and you control it all the way through. So there must be a method to be able to do that. Look for this particular method in your methodology. Second is you should look for, in the context of what we're speaking around here, does it have lean practices around managing change? Change management at a high level is around communication training. Does it have placeholders in your methodology all the way through its life cycle? Those steps, those tasks identified that help you manage these three. Lean practices around change management. Lastly, you should also look for placeholders for data migration around the methodology. Look for specific controls that exist within the project planning and the methodology that helps you migrate data and provide that visibility in terms of how you are increasing your pace and the confidence in which you're able to prepare your data as you start to. Across the project, for you to be able to do this, your methodology should support a method of being able to quantify value that you're generating, quantify deviations against the benefits it's providing. This is what you should look for. Now, we will try to focus on the first one, which is managing scope. The method that we use as part of our methodology is to be able to use a SIPOC method. If you have not heard of the SIPOC as a concept, it's a Lean Six Sigma concept. The concept is to be able to eliminate ambiguities in a process and to be able to visualize it seamlessly. So it is an abbreviation, as you see in the picture, for a supplier, an input, a process, output, and a customer. That is what a SIPOC stands for. As you'll see, the process is in the center. So every process has an input and it has an output. That input is a resource, or it could be a data element, and it has an output. That is the consumer of that particular process and the data element. And each of those inputs has an organization, a department, or a person that is a supplier for that particular process, and we have a SIPOC method helps you quantify a visual process flow into a tabular structure to be able to eliminate all ambiguities and bring in that visibility at a granular level. Now, what is the benefit a SIPOC method provides to be able to quantify scope into your project? It will help all members of the project to view processes in the same light. It will also provide a visual bridge. How do you transition from a bunch of scattered requirements that exist when you start the project, as you transition from a buying psychology to an implementing psychology? You have a bunch of requirements scattered across, right? How do you tie that to the project mandate, which is the benefit realization objective, and translate that into a to-be process? It provides that single particular view. It not only provides a view task by task, process by process, sub-process by sub-process, it will also provide the overall business view, provide an articulation of the benefits that you should get. What it will also help you is, when you're inheriting the best practice from a standard system, and try to inherit that without any customizations, without very minimal customizations, or you take the industry best practice or try to implement it in your organization, it will help you eliminate steps that you do not think it is necessary because that's not the way how you do business. So it will help you eliminate waste. Not all processes are probably relevant to you. It will help you cut it out and remove those outputs that are unnecessary. Hence, these are non-value added steps you'll be able to remove, at the same time make these processes more efficient for you. It will also help you clearly articulate what is your current state, so that you have a clear envisioning of the to-be processes in terms of how the system will look, how the business will look, what's the benefits that you would get by adopting this method. So,
this particular screen, if you look at it, it's the same methodology. How do you cover this? Right in the beginning of the project, you convert your best practice process into a SIPOC structure. You have a lot of fill up the blanks. You have those blanks, which is fine. Then you go through a gap assessment. You quantify those gaps. And then, as you see in the design stage, that is where you start evolving that particular solution into a SIPOC format. So that is where you first do an evolution. You're able to state the to-be process in a structured fashion that all stakeholders understand. And that is signed off towards the middle of the design before we even actually have the system ready to be shown. Once that is done, the SIPOC takes control of the particular project. Your scope is defined, all stakeholders have the same view. Then it takes control, because when we do your proof of concepts, that is to accept that the system has been designed correctly, it is scripted as per the SIPOC, categorized by processes and sub-processes and roles and so on and so on, right? You go further down, you go to your key user training as part of your validation of the system, you again script it as per the SIPOC, because people have the same view. Go through acceptance tests, the users have to do it. They must have clarity of thought in order to be able to test a system that they have been simply just trained on a few days or weeks ago. The SIPOC provides the answer because it provides systematic steps that they have articulated and signed off. Finally, you take an extract of that particular SIPOC by the roles of the people who are involved, and you conduct your end user trainings that way. And that in turn becomes their ready reckoner and their ready guide on day-to-day use when they start using the system.
So in the end, your SIPOC structure takes over the project in terms of controlling scope. Now, let's take a practical method in terms of how do you do this. It's a three-step approach. Step number one, you have a small extract out of an Excel sheet that is pasted there, right? That is your requirements. That is your best practices that come in, industry best practices, ERP best practices. Against that, as part of your initial scoping exercise, you go through each of that particular row and say, is this something that I need in my business? Is it something that we do today? If we don't do it today, but if we think we need it, is it aligned to the benefits or the project charter or the ROI objective that you have? Is there an incremental step that the system is recommending that you don't want to do today or is asking you to do today? Again, please question it and say, is it aligned to a benefit? Yes. Do you see a gap? Have those notes. Once you have that, you evolve that particular structure into a SIPOC structure. That is what you see towards that. So that's a three-step method that you go through. It makes your scoping extremely meticulous, extremely systematic. And when you come out of that in very early the design phase, you have your entire to-be state already mapped out extremely clearly, not only visually, but also like a tabular structure. So in this particular screen, what you see is an example of how a SIPOC will actually look. Now, of course, you have some flexibility to modify this. In this particular example, if you look at the categorization, you have a major process area. So it defines all the steps in a process area such as order to cash. Then you have a sub-process area creating a quotation or an order or managing your master data and so on. Then you have the role that provides that input. Then you have the description that describes the process in plain English for business to be able to review. Then you have the affected parties on both sides, right? And then you have this scenario. So imagine these scenarios if you're in a multi-company environment, a different business need area. Those scenarios could be different. Or if you imagine yourself in a company that has got multiple lines of business, you could be selling, you could be executing projects, you could be doing after-sales service. So they're all scenarios that are internal matrix to every process description. So when you take this is how the SIPOC evolves. So when you go forward into this project, right, you're able to validate. You look at the particular matrix, take a particular scenario, look at all the steps that are applicable, evaluate your system against those steps. Does the system deliver against that particular step? Yes, you're able to sign off. Now you can train the users exactly like that, and you can take that particular project. That way you have your project scope very well controlled. Now that the project scope is very well controlled, you must be able to manage the third pillar that we started to talk about, which is how do you manage change? So essentially, what is change, right? Change management is nothing but preparing users for change, number one, right? Number two is check if they're indeed ready. You prepare them and then check if they're ready. Number three is you ensure that they're ready. So these are essentially, if you demystify change management, sometimes it sounds like an extremely complex or big word, but the reality is it's just three steps. Check if they're ready, prepare them to be ready, right? And manage that particular change. So it is all around, if you translate that to actions on a project, it's around communication, number one. Communicate what's going on. Have a readiness assessments included in your methodology to check if they're really ready. Finally, ensure that you have trained them correctly. So it's communication, readiness assessment, and training management. So what you should look for in your methodology is, how do you do that, right? If you have to have a very practical organizational change management, your methodology. How do you do this? How do you do these steps? You look at those boxes that are there, right? These boxes are the ones in the different colors that represent the different deliverables. Anything you define in your methodology deliverables from 1 to 10. These are deliverables that you must have in your methodology. And the starting point is to be able to identify your change network. These are the individuals in your organization who control change and who manage change, who can effectively administer change. Identify a change network during your project management plan. Then define and ensure that your implementers are supporting the project management plan with a very detailed training management plan. Have that articulation very well defined. Also define as part of your project management plan, your communications plan as well. Now you take the training management plan, communications plan, ensure that it has the acceptance of your change network. So that is how you manage that. And then communications are key. As you go through your design phase, ensure that when you're hitting end of design phase, all change network people are appropriately communicated, right? And then as you start to go through the process beyond design, that is where the project starts to intensify. Ensure that the communication cadence is there. This is what you should ensure it is there in your methodology, in your sequence of steps. The next thing is around training management. As I said, project management plan must have a training plan. And then the important thing is to check just before we are ready to start the validation of the system. When we are about to start training of your key users, ensure that your methodology supports a checklist that the training content is appropriately prepared. Number one, all the key users identified are ready to be trained. They are familiar with the processes, they understand the goal, right? Training preparation is key for training to be effective. Then finally, when you take it to the end users, ensure that they are training ready, they have the content ready. And finally, while you have done the training, part of the process must be to evaluate in terms of was the training effective? Is there a need for me to retrain? How many of them really understood the process? Did they understand the scope? That's the second component. Third one is around readiness assessments. Number one is you have the change network. And while you go to this particular project, ensure that you have the appropriate stage reviews that are happening. Ensure that you're transitioning correctly. Important component is what you see as deliverables in the deploy phase. Your project methodology must contain, which is called as the heat map. As you go live, have heat maps in your methodology must support heat maps that show transaction intake prior to the implementation, after the implementation. It will identify all false positives if there exists. And that will also lead to, it is tied towards training management. See if the heat maps are showing negative signs. Is there a need for retraining? Is there a need for reapplication, calling those users? Was the training effective? And so on. So we conduct those trainings iteratively so that we get the benefits. Finally, lessons learned is a key component because your ERP project is your first step towards digitization. As you start to optimize further, having the change network, communicating them back to in terms of how the project performed, where you struggled, and get their buy-in into subsequent optimization initiatives is key. If you're able to get that, you will not only be able to hit the first step around implementing your project right, then you will be able to go and derive those benefits for optimization. So those are the essentials in terms of how you manage change. Now the last pillar. You have a methodology, you have your scope well defined, you have your change as well reasonably managed, is how do you manage your outcome financially? Insist upon your implementation partner to have earned value metrics in the project. It helps you to predict financial health pretty early into the project, and it will help you take corrective actions. Ideal method is, as you see in the first picture on the left side, is to be able to ask your implementation partner to be able to provide very accurate progress percentage. Ideally, it should be on a professional services automation platform. There are enough tools out there like Jira, like Xerox's, even MS Project in the cloud, and so on, where all the users are able to collaborate and your percentage of completion is accurate. That's the first point. Once you get that, you plot your percentage of completion to be able to plot what have you spent actually on the project, what was your planned expenditure at that particular time, and what is the value that you have generated, monetized against that particular project. what you see in the picture is actually a live representation of how a project earned value chart could look like. So you plot it against those three lines, which is your actual costs versus plan versus the earned value. And that way you will be able to see the efficiency of your project. You'll be able to see the benefit realization of it. And you don't have to wait till the end of the project to be able to take corrective actions. You'll be able to take corrective actions proactively. And you can do that with 4 or 5 different key metrics that are there. This is what leads to project budget overruns. First is you should be able to predict variance at completion pretty early. If you're going to see a variance, you should know it early so that we can take corrective action. For that, you should know what is the estimate to complete, which is how much money do I have left? And then what is the estimated completion? How much money do I need to be able to complete this project? And these three are represented by as indices as a schedule performance index or a cost performance index. Ask your implementation partner to be able to provide this as a part of their methodology so that you have that control from a controlling perspective. And just not having these metrics is not enough. You should be able to get visibility to the source of these variances. Once you have the source of these variances pretty early and take remediative root cause action. Many a times it happens that you start to see overruns. It could be because just not the partner himself. It could be because some users within your own organization are dragging the project into conversations that are not necessary, or are having conversations around processes that are not aligned to benefits, that are not mandated from a vision perspective. A lot of time gets wasted in such conversations that are not benefit aligned or outcome aligned. So when you see that, you will be able to identify which resources are consuming more time. Go down, do a root cause analysis. You will be able to identify that we are spending time on processes that are not aligned to business benefits that you are seeing. That way, you will be able to control it proactively pretty early. So insist on your implementation partners to be able to provide that as part of the methodology. So finally, a recap in terms of what we have spoken. Your methodology for you to be able to successfully manage towards an outcome should support these 3 areas. Management of scope, which is converting your best practices, qualifying gaps against them, against a business need and a business benefit, converting that into a SIPOC structure and maintaining that SIPOC structure as your scope controlling document throughout the life cycle of the project. Number 1. Next one is in terms of key components in terms of managing change. Ensure that communication is there. You have a change network that is identified, communications plan that is there, and your plan communicates your generic and targeted stage-wise and task-wise communication is upfront available. Check if the users are ready for this change periodically. If they're not ready, don't go forward. Have a review and correct it, right? You provide the training readiness. Is training effective? Is it happening correctly? Is it well prepared? Are the users serious? Look at all exceptions that are made in every stage gate to be able to move forward. Assess it by impact of process, data, and people. One ideal method you could also recommend that we do in part of our larger engagement, just prior to go live, have a readiness assessment workshop. Have the key users present to business owners in terms of how they're able to conduct the business with the new software without additional help. That will help you understand that they're ready for the transition. Have heat maps and have your lessons learned. Finally, training management. Ensure that there's a training management plan provided by your partner. Ensure training is appropriately well prepared and executed. And more importantly, as soon as the training is over, evaluate the effectiveness of the training. Finally, budget. Get to the accurate percentage complete throughout all the periodic intervals that you agree with your partner. Plot them into a project as cover on non-value training. These 3 pillars must be covered by the 4th one called as the implementation methodology. If you're able to get to that, you will be able to address a successful outcome. That is the summary in terms of what we wanted to take through today in this particular session. And this is a starting in the series of sessions that we wanted to plan. First is to take to the top level in terms of these 4 main pillars that are needed. And of course, there's a lot of detail in terms of to be able to get that outcome right. So just to pick an example is data management. How do you manage data in its life cycle? How can we get more deeper into scope? How do you manage risks? How do you manage and so on and so on. So, but the starting step is these 3, 4 pillars, and that is what we wanted to run you through in this particular session. And thank you for your time.
Hi, Sri. We have a few questions. This is just a reminder to anyone who has not posted their questions yet. We have 10 more minutes, so we can probably take a few more questions. I'll go to the first question now, Sri. This question is from Ghassan Kabra. How do you recommend you address user resistance during change management?
See, user resistance, I'm repeating the question, Kumar, so that I understand this correctly. I think the question was, how do you recommend you manage user resistance in the project lifecycle? Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, good, right? User resistance typically is an ingredient part around managing change. And that is why I was talking about demystifying organizational change. Proactive management calls for three areas. Number one, at the starting of your project, when you're preparing for the project itself, identifying your change network. When I say change network, identifying the people who are in your organization who are not necessarily key users, but have an influence on either key users or end users in terms of managing that change. Identify and map those change network who need to take that message forward across to them. That is number one, right? Number two is in terms of communication. Resistance usually comes when people either don't feel that they are included, right? Or when they feel that they have not been communicated well, adequately in adequate notice, right? Or they have not been involved in the respective areas where they should be. Having a change network, number one, is essential in order to be able to percolate that message. You support that through having that communications targeted based on the concurrence of the change network. That is number two. And the final pockets of resistance also come in because as part of the change management process is that we have probably not measured effectiveness of our training, effectiveness of our content. We have also probably not measured in terms of user feedback and the change network going through gaps that have been rejected potentially been raised by a certain user. So it's all around managing these three elements, which is communications, readiness assessment, and training. And all is controlled through a network of stakeholders, what we call as change network, who can influence these users. And that is a scientific method to be able to do that. And you can actually draw your project plan and the project management plan to be able to address this systematically. In our experience, this has been extremely effective.
Thanks, Sri. And I understand that you're going to devote an entire session exclusively for change management in the future, right?
That is correct.
The next question is, how do we control scope when some part of the organization is resistant or insisting on following a non-standard way of doing something? Everybody else is aligned and there is one part of the organization which wants to do it in a different way. How do we control the scope of the project in such a situation?
Fantastic question, Kumar. It again boils down to what I was saying earlier, right? That is where the SIPOC as a tool comes in very handy. Now, before that as well, of course, SIPOC is just a method of articulating a process without ambiguity. But in this particular case, the recommendation is that when you're starting off on scoping the project, number one, you have your best practices come in. Then you go through a meticulous run through of each of these best practices. Now we will come to this particular department or section that wants to follow these practices differently. These are identified as gaps in that particular process. Once you do that, you have a process of, as part of the scope quantification, a qualification of these gaps in terms of their alignment to the benefit that is expected from the system. And you score those gaps that come in against the need of the business and against the needs of the benefits for which the system is being implemented. And if that particular gap scores adequately in support of the justification for it, the recommendation is that you incorporate it, right? If it scores negatively, then it is not aligned to what the need of the business need of the objective initiative is, then that is not incorporated, right? That is how it must be managed. And this is where your change network, your governance function, a very systematic method of quantifying and qualifying gap assessments and alignment to the business need and business outcome becomes necessary. So that such a thing is not arbitrary. That way, you're able to argue against those specific divisions as well who want to do differently, why their intention is not aligned to the overall benefit or to business object. And of course, if it is aligned, that becomes a part of your gap assessment.
Right. Thanks, Sri. That question, by the way, was from Jose. The next question is from Mukund. How can we effectively align? I think it's very similar to the previous question. How do we effectively align all parties using change management for project success?
Very good. I think that question almost summarizes the main topics here, right? When you look at alignment as well, when we talked about 3 pillars today. One is managing scope, next is managing change, and next is managing budgets. It comes across when you speak like that, there are actually 3 independent topics, but actually they are not, right? So they are actually all embedded through. All these things are traversing throughout the project in its life cycle. So that is the brilliance of the using of a SIPOC method, a Lean Six Sigma method is, number one, is you are able to get all parties aligned and have the same view in terms of how a to-be process will be. So you have obtained that alignment already, right? If you're able to follow that method, number one. Now that you have followed that particular method, now you must increase the rigor on your change management side of it in order to be able to establish a change network, communicate that, and obtain acceptance. And when you obtain that acceptance, you mean the training acceptance and measuring effectiveness of training. Those 3 steps are on change management. So having a singular view on SIPOCs, having the entire business to view it as one, number one, and then reinforce that through a rigorous, simplified, lean OCM approach into your methodology, will be able to get all parties aligned.
Thanks, Sri. The next question, a follow-up question from Mukund is, any practical advice on avoiding delays in a project? I think you alluded to this, and again, I believe you will have a session on controlling as well in the future. But if you could just maybe give one example from your past experience, that would be good.
Sure, right? It's 2 things, right? Usually, projects delay happens is because scope not being quantified, or even if it is quantified, not communicated and not agreed explicitly amongst all parties. And it is usually not agreed amongst all parties because it is not clear to all parties to be able to agree prior to. So it is usually the realization of a to-be process or a visualization of the to-be process usually happens when you try to provide a proof of concept session, and that is when the first realization happens of a misalignment. So your project plan starts to slip because now you are having to rework and reconvince yourself in terms of what the to-be process is. This is where being able to bring a SIPOC method helps, because you are able to obtain that alignment pretty quickly early on, number one. Second reason for delay is in terms of if you get past this particular hurdle, right, you have a hurdle around data management. That has been the biggest impact as I have seen in several projects. And that is something that for want of time, it's a little heavy topic. We did not want to have a part of this particular session. That's something that we wanted to plan against in a subsequent session as well, in terms of how do you manage data migration in an ERP project using lean practices, so that you're able to migrate very effectively without delays. That's the second one. The third one is in terms of around training management and being effective around it, right? So it's essentially covered 2 areas around this to answer this particular question today. I think it's almost like a panacea that your SIPOC will try to address most of it actually is true, as well as change management. But today we did not cover the third important and the biggest risk as well, which is around data migration. That's actually planned for a subsequent session.
Thanks, Sri. The next question is from Simon. The question is, what is the value of repeatedly updating the SIPOC after freezing the scope? This question is from Simon.
Good point, right? The value of the SIPOC purposes serves multiple purposes, right? Keep in mind the SIPOC evolves as we go through, right? At the starting of the particular project, you are creating a SIPOC skeleton because you're not starting from a blank piece of paper. Your best practices have been converted into that particular structure. You have meticulously gone through, weeded out all steps, perhaps best practice, but not applicable to you. So you have tried to make it lean, reduce wastage, and make it optimized. Now, the next step that you go through is you evolve the SIPOC to be a far more detailed description of the to-be processes, such that your business is able to sign off. This is still at an evolution phase. Now you have the scope more or less tied from a business perspective. The business owners are able to sign off because it is also time to benefit articulation. It evolves further into the life cycle now because although the scope is tied from a business perspective, there is devil in the detail. While we get into a proof of concept, you start to get into those technical details. Should the field be aligned like this? Should I have this particular report? How should it be aligned? You start to evolve it as well so that it starts to evolve itself from being a to-be process into almost being a script. Now your scope is finalized, it already becomes a script. Now, the world is not perfect. When you run proof of concept, you have locked down your SIPOC, you have achieved that. As you run through a proof of concept sessions, of course, some exceptions are identified. Now, these exceptions could just be understanding exceptions. It probably means that the process needs to be elaborated a little finely as well. So you elaborate that. So your SIPOC has just evolved a little further, right, for it to be taken to user acceptance. In the same thing happens as well during user acceptance. Now the SIPOC is a script that they will use, but as they run through practically live cases, they will probably find a little more exceptions as well, right? That you might want to capture it back. And that is where you keep updating the SIPOC once again, because at any point of time, it will reflect the transition from a bunch of requirements, from a bunch of as-is to the to-be. And keep in mind, your to-be is not fully evolved yet, right? Now you have past user acceptance. And then finally, as you go towards go live, if there are exceptions that are coming up on issue review on go live, and if that calls for a change, if that calls for an impact or an elaboration of these processes, you do as well. Now, keep in mind that we talked about an extremely theoretical approach that there is no change whatsoever. But keep in mind that I also talked about in the beginning around benefits management and outcome management, right? It is very well likely that as you're walking through that particular process as well, that the business sees the need for additional functionality that they come through that is actually adding incremental benefit. It is very well possible. So when you're bringing in those incremental changes that are aligned to business benefits, of course, you want to ensure that your to-be processes are updated as well. And all your end user documentation is also tied to your SIPOC. So hence, there's a need for it to be kept updated. If not, you actually start to lose the purpose of it.
Okay, thanks, Sri. The next question is from Mujtaba. How do you bridge the gap between end users and the implementation team? I think again you are going to be covering this later, but if you could just give a quick answer now.
Yeah, I think the question is around a gap, an understanding gap between what the implementations teams think in terms of what it is and what the end users perceive that what they are getting. I think that's the question around it. And again, some of the answer is going back to what I said, right? That is one of the key benefits of what a SIPOC method provides. Most of the projects, and that is why this technique we have incorporated into our methodology in India today, is because time and again, I think this question is probably coming from experience and in terms of what has happened, because consultants, implementation consultants have a software view in terms of this is what it will get in. When it reaches the end user, they have a different perspective, and there is a gap. And that is why I think this question is alluding to that misalignment. What the SIPOC tools will have is to get over that misalignment very, very early. Every person, stakeholder, the consultants, key users, everybody has the same view of the to-be process. So when the end user training happens and the key user training happens, the change network, everybody has the same. Hence, it is hugely recommended, and in terms of our experience, wherever we have introduced the SIPOC as a principle in our implementations in the last 12 to 18 months, it has provided significant benefits of alignment. All parties have the same view, and wastage elimination has simply been enormous.
Okay, thanks, Sri. The next question is from Nitya. How can we leverage training better to manage resistance? I think you have already answered this question. Do you have anything more to add?
Sure, it's a good question, right? I spoke about how you should have training as a concept in your methodology and how you should enforce it and how you should measure its effectiveness. But what we did not touch upon today in this particular session was how do you administer it, right? As well. That's part of the upcoming sessions we want to plan is in terms of the ideal methods of administering training is ideally through a learning management system and how you're able to provide simulated training content that's almost like you nowadays your car driving tests and driving lessons are in a simulated environment or if you're running a plane airplane simulator as a toy. You're able to provide training on ERP systems, Epicor included, on simulated environments, and that's a part of our methodology as well. That's a subsequent session that's planned where how to increase the effectiveness of this training using learning management platforms. And how are you able to scientifically measure learning, acceptance, and the capability of users as well to adapt. Right? That's a upcoming session that's planned as well, and I hope to cover that with fair detail as we go through.
Right. Thanks. We have time for just one last question. Actually, we are in the last minute now, so I'll just ask one last question. Unfortunately, we have 4 more, so maybe we can respond by email to this gentleman. This question is, you spoke about scale and SIPOC, and can you just tell me fundamentally how is it different from, say, any other methodology like SAP or Signature? Is there any difference? And by adopting this, are there any examples where you can say timelines have been shrunk or projects have been delivered faster?
Certainly, right? Most of methodologies, right, to be fair to all, right, they follow a more or less very high level approach. But where I think there are some differentiators, this has come from our own lessons learned over the years, reviewing and every project in terms of where weaknesses are the tools that you incorporate into the detail. There are some essential tools that we have incorporated. One is being the SIPOC as a tool that we spoke about today in terms of lessons learned. The other tools that we have incorporated into the methodologies using a Kaizen technique, where you're able to do a continuous lesson learning process throughout the journey of the project, able to identify all negative observations versus positive observations during the project and reinforce them and so on. We didn't speak about it yet, so we've incorporated those things as well into it, which I think are extremely differentiating, including the learning management method as well, right? And data migration as well, a very meticulous data planning method. All this have resulted where we have come to a maturity where we're able to say that we can significantly drop implementation times by 30 to 40% as against what you typically see. This is a typical project. But when you start to take towards cloud and when you have an ability to go to a very standardized system and a method to be able to implement extremely standardized, your cost benefits could just be enormous in terms of how you're able to see. Significant time, cost, and more than that, right? It is around wastage reduction. Because if we waste X amount of time of an implementer, the amount of time of the customer that's wasted is almost 3 or 4 times. So you're able to eliminate that huge wastage in the process. That is what we have seen.
Yeah. Thank you, Sri. I think we have run out of time. We do have some more questions, so we can get back to them by email, I hope, as a follow-up. Thanks, everybody. And as we mentioned earlier, we will have 4 more sessions. This is a part of a series. Each of the topics that Sri covered, they will be specifically covered in a follow-up session. And thanks, everyone, for all the active participation and questions. Looking forward to seeing you again shortly. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time, everybody. I really appreciate your time and patience. And thank you again. I look forward to hearing more. Thank you.